That was epic. Oh my gosh. All right, this better be good. Um, just kidding. Good morning, everyone. Glad to see you. Just a quick announcement before I dive into the word. I just want to let everyone know that, for this month, Pastor Steve and his wife Hannah, they're going to be taking some time away on a short sabbatical, just for a month. And so that's an intentional time of rest in the Lord. And so if you think of them, please don't email them. Okay, Pastor Steve is going to be tempted to reply, but do not do that. But just pray for them, lift up encouraging prayers for them. And what's actually going to happen is we're going to have 5 different speakers continue on for the rest of this month and on, and some in-house, some from the outside, but all of it hopefully will be a blessing for us, and we'll all continue to go through the book of Romans together for us, okay? Change. Change is something that we hear about often. It's something that we talk about. It's something that we dream of. And when it comes to Christianity, change is something that is seemingly at the forefront, because we talk about things and hear about things like life, joy, peace, discipline, strength. And these are things that not just we want to hear about that sound good, but it's things that we want to know intimately and personally. We want to be changed. We don't just want to hear about it. We want to be transformed ourselves. And we want the people around us, especially our friends and family, we want them to be transformed and changed as well. We want this to happen. We don't just want to hear about it, we want to experience it. And the question I think that a lot of us have coming in, and especially if you ever felt like, man, it's just another Sunday, it's just another Friday, it's just another cell group. If you ever feel like that, maybe it's because you feel like, you know what? Nothing is really changing or progressing. Everything feels the same. It feels mundane, routine, boring, dry. So the question for us this morning that I'm going to try to address is, how do we change? How do the people around us change? How does transformation happen? Because this is what we want. We want something to be different. We want to be better. We want to look more like Jesus. How does this actually practically happen? And so we're going to dive right in this morning because we have a great passage. But if you have your Bibles, please turn with me to Romans chapter 12. How can we be transformed? And how can this change not just be superficial or quickly passing, but how can it be authentic and long-lasting? Romans 12, it begins, we looked at it last week, and it began with Paul talking about the mercies of God. The mercies of God. It creates this transformation that we shouldn't be conformed to the world, but change ought to happen. And then Paul pivots from verse 1, talking about mercy, to the idea of grace, and how grace is also transformative for us. And I think the reason why he starts with these two things, mercy and grace, is because mercy and grace are two sides of the same coin. See, what mercy is taking away something bad. So taking away sin, taking away punishment, taking away guilt and shame. And grace, on the other hand, is the giving of something good, like salvation, acceptance, love. And this concept, grace, is going to kind of frame our entire passage this morning. See, because grace is deeply transformative for us. And so if you want change and transformation, something different, something better, if you want your faith to grow, this morning we're going to be taking a look at 3 things, 3 ways in which grace changes us, 3 ways in which grace ought to change us. Or maybe you can look at it like this. These are 3 things that are needed for us to change. And maybe if we haven't been growing, if we feel kind of stagnant, maybe one of these 3 items is missing in our lives. The first is humility. The second is community. And the third one is service. Humility, community, service. I tried to be cute and I tried to rhyme it, but it didn't work out like that. I tried to do it like Pastor Steve alliteration, didn't work out like that. But we'll go through these and hopefully it'll be kind of helpful and clear for us. So let's start with humility. If you want to be changed, we need to start with humility, because it is very difficult for prideful people to change. Very difficult. And so if we want to be changed in any way, humility must be at the forefront. and grace humbles us. Let's look at Romans chapter 12. We're going to start together in verse 3. It says this: "For by the grace given to me," Paul is writing, "I say to everyone among you not to think of himself or herself more highly than he or she ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." And so God is speaking through the writings of Paul here, and it begins with grace. And although Paul is speaking about receiving grace personally himself, it says here that he's speaking to everyone, that grace has been received among many people. He's addressing to everyone, and he's giving everyone a warning. And the warning is, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought to. Don't do that. But he clarifies in explaining this, and he says, but instead, think with sober judgment or a sound mind. You ought to have an accurate view of yourself. If you want to be changed, you first need to have an accurate picture of who you are first. So you know how change can happen. So you know how you need to change, how you ought to change. And grace gives us sober judgment, clarity, accuracy, humility. And I think some of us, the reason why Paul is talking like this is, he says to everyone, we ought to think of ourselves not so high, we ought to have a humble view. And I think it's because a lot of us fall into one category, or some of us fall into one category where we naturally, for whatever reason maybe, have a higher view of ourselves. We're pretty self-confident people. We feel pretty accomplished, pretty good. We look at ourselves in the mirror and we're like, all right, not bad. We have this view of ourselves. And to these people, maybe Paul has this verse in mind from James 1:17. Every good and perfect gift comes from above. And this is so humbling because anything you want to boast in, any accomplishment or success that you have had, it says here that it's from God. It's from above. Everything good you have. And so even if you want to boast, grace humbly whispers and reminds us, those resources you had, where is that from? That network, those relationships, those genetics, that personality, that work ethic, those ideas, where is it from? Where did you get those things? And maybe you think, oh, well, my parents, I think my parents passed down a lot of these things. Okay, well then how did your parents meet? Well, then God sovereignly orchestrates everything, and he is a generous God. He gives us everything good that we have, and so we have nothing to boast in. We are all humbled, especially for those who have a high view of ourselves. But then some of us, we look at this passage and we're like, don't have a high view of yourself. You might be thinking, well, I have a pretty low view of myself. Like, I grew up not feeling very confident. I have low self-esteem. Like, I'm already down here, and Paul is saying not to think. He's like, and you might be thinking, no, I need a pep talk. I need someone to encourage me. And I find Tim Keller, in his book, he writes this in The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. He says this, and I think it's very helpful for us. He says, the essence of gospel humility, kind of similar to C.S. Lewis, the essence of gospel humility is not thinking more of myself or thinking less of myself. It is thinking of myself less. So in other words, whether you feel amazing about yourself, you have high self-esteem, or maybe you have low self-esteem, you don't feel too great about yourself, both of these things are a very actually selfish, narcissistic, prideful way to think, because all of it orients you, it's you thinking about you, who you are, what you've done, you feeling a certain way about yourself. And Paul is saying to everyone, we ought to be humble. If you've experienced grace by any degree, it should humble you, whether you have high self-esteem or low self-esteem. And I think the way that it works out for us, I think one of the clearest pictures we have is in our salvation. Look at the last part of verse 3 with me. It says this: each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned or distributed. In our salvation, we contribute nothing. And sometimes we're tempted to think, oh, well, but I made a decision. Like I was at this camp, or I was at this retreat or this conference, and someone preached, but it was my faith. Like I didn't die on the cross. I didn't do that. Jesus, of course, did that, but it's my faith. But even here, Paul reminds us, the measure of faith that you have been assigned, that God has given to you, is also a gift of grace. You can't even produce faith to believe in Jesus. Even your faith comes from God, and it is a gift from him. And this right here, I think Paul is talking about the same measure of faith we have, that all of us have, saving faith in Jesus. So grace humbles everyone, all of us. And in order for us to change, we need to be humble. Humble. And then Paul continues to move on, and he actually says for us something I think pretty beautiful. And it's that the gospel, it's not just grace humbling us individually. What the gospel does is grace also brings us into a community of other people who have also experienced the grace of God. And so we gather with other people together. And this is how I think change oftentimes is sparked, and definitely where change is sustained. I was having a conversation with Pastor Ben actually this week, and he was telling me, hey, what are you doing this Sunday? And I'm like, I'm preaching. He's like, oh, cool. He's like, well, how's it going? I'm like, okay. And he's like, yeah, I realize preaching is, it's important, good for you, continue to prepare. But then he was saying another really important part of our spiritual life actually is community, conversation. When you actually talk through with other people and wrestle through doubts, questions, you share your real issues, and you actually begin to work through some of these things. That so much actually happens in community because you need other people to help encourage you and remind you and strengthen you. And this is exactly what Paul is talking about next. The second thing that we need, not just humility, but if we want to change, especially if we want to sustain change, we need to be plugged into a community. And that's what oftentimes we call the church. So let's continue in Romans chapter 12 in verse 4 and 5. It says this, "For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function. So we, though many, are one body in Christ and individual members of one another." The metaphor that Paul is using here for describing spiritual community in the church is the body. And the reason is because the body, he elaborates in other places, but he says the body, we have many different parts, but they all function together. There is a harmony, a unity. And so although there's a diversity in the parts, there is a unity in the goal. And as I think about this a little bit more, Paul, he is so in love with the church, he tries to use different metaphors to explain what community ought to be like. And I find it pretty fascinating that Paul, he never brings up, when it comes to spiritual community, he never brings up team sports. He never brings up a business dynamic or an organization. Even though in other places he talks about athletics, he talks about having a great work ethic, but he never uses that as a metaphor for the church. What he uses instead is something very deep and intimate. And the way he describes church over and over again is he uses metaphors like the body, family, marriage. This is what the church ought to look like. And I feel like when we think about these things, the body, marriage, family, there's a deep sense of intimacy, of belonging, and commitment. Commitment. It's not just a place where people can come and go and move in and out. It should be this place where we build intimate, deep relationships and friendships. And for a lot of us, if we're honest, people leave the church when we feel like these things are deteriorating. We feel like it's not really the church anymore because that commitment, that connection, that intimacy is gone. And I know for some of us, it's very tempting now today, I think, to want to just treat church like, we kind of boil it down to just preaching or music. And we feel like, hey, what if I just have Christian friends and I just talk to Christian friends? Like, do I really still have to go to church? What if I could just podcast or listen to sermons? Like, isn't that like pretty much listen to like a few worship songs? Isn't that pretty much the same thing? I could just do that at home by myself. Why do I actually have to come to church and be committed to a local church? What's the uniqueness of that? And I would actually say, committing yourself to a local church is actually, in a lot of ways, way harder than just doing and handpicking your friends and your sermons and your worship songs. It's actually way harder. See, if I listen to so many sermons online, and sometimes the sermons get boring. Okay, I'm sorry if this is happening right now to you, but if it gets boring, I'm just like, dude, this is like dragging on. I'll just double tap, like jump 30 seconds. I'm like, still boring, still boring, still boring. Okay, next, I'm done. I just get, but right now, see, if you're bored, it's hard, right? Look, because you can't pause me. Like, you can't, like you can walk out, right? But it's different because when you're in community, you have to deal with real people, their issues, them irritating you and annoying you, their sense of humor being strange, or like you have to interact with real people, and it gets hard and challenging, and of course it does. But the way that we change, of course God can change us through comfort and personal preference, of course. But oftentimes we are stretched and we change faster when we are uncomfortable. And in some ways, there is nothing more uncomfortable than being part of a local church. And committing to that looks different for us in many different ways. For some of us, being committed to a local church, it actually means membership. Maybe we've been attending for so long, but for whatever reason, we're just not a member. And maybe God is calling you to that. For others of us, committing to the local church means prioritizing the Sunday morning slot, the Friday or the whenever your cell group or college or youth group meets, prioritizing those slots to meet and build relationships with other people. Maybe for others of us, being committed to a community and experiencing change actually is not leaving when drama hits and relationships get broken, but working through forgiving and reconciliation. Others of us, committing to a church looks like submitting to leadership, not out of guilt, but out of just faithfulness to God. To grow and to change, we need community. And I think one of the saddest things that I see sometimes is someone who is particularly going through a difficult time of life, needing community so badly, but that person has not done the groundwork of building relationships with people so that they actually end up struggling alone. It's so heartbreaking to see that. And so for us to change, for us to grow, we need humility, we need to be humble, we need community, we need other people to strengthen us, to be there for us when we go through hard times, because we will all go through hard times. Who's gonna be there for us when we do? And thirdly, service. See, if being a Christian is just being humble and being in a community, I think Christianity will become pretty boring, pretty dry, pretty quick. I think what a lot of us actually want is we want a vision. We want to be part of something greater. We want to have a meaning. We want to have purpose. We want to be active. We want to be part of something with direction and activity and momentum. We don't just want to be called into salvation, as great as that is. We don't just want to sit next to people with the same beliefs week after week, as comfortable as that is. We want to be called into service. We want to contribute to something. So let's look at the last section this morning. Romans 12, verses 6 through 8. It says this, Paul writes, "Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, use them. If prophecy in proportion to our faith, if service in our serving, the one who teaches in his teaching, the one who exhorts in his exhortation, the one who contributes in his generosity, the one who leads with zeal, the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness." When it comes to faith, it says in verse 3, God gives all of us a standard measure of saving faith, that we all have enough faith to be saved, the same. But when it comes to gifting, Paul kind of shifts and he says, gifting is different. God gives different gifts of different degrees to different people. He gives all of us different talents, unique things that we have that are different than maybe the person sitting next to us, than even our family member, than even our twin. We're all given unique gifts that God has given. And I think oftentimes we have this tendency to kind of compare. Like we'll look at this girl and we'll be like, man, she is so gifted at singing. I wish I could do that. I don't have that gift. Or we'll look at another person and we'll think, man, that guy, he's such an alpha leader. He's so strong. I wish I had that. And some of us, we kind of feel like that sometimes, like, oh man, that looks so nice to have those abilities, that talent. And we kind of sometimes feel like, man, how is that fair? Like, I wish I had that. But see, Jesus teaches in Matthew 25 a parable called the parable of the talents, or we could maybe call it the parable of the gifts. And it's the story of God being a master, leaving and giving 3 servants different amounts of talents. To one, he gives 5. To another, he gives 3. And to the last, he gives 1. And upon returning, God comes back and he asks the servants, what did you do with what I gave you? The one with 5 and 2 return 5 more and 2 more. And they say, we've done something, we used it. And God applauds them and he says, well done, my good and faithful servant. But then to the one, he asks, what have you done? And that person, instead of using their gift or their talent, they buried it in the ground and just returned the original one that they were given. And this parable and this passage is kind of echoing the exact same thing, which is, if you want to be faithful to God, we are called to use the gifts and talents that we've been given. We ought to use these things, not just for a salary, not just for career advancement, but we're called to use the talents and gifts that we've been given by God to build the church and to advance the gospel. That's what we're called to do. And before I dive into some of these gifts, and Paul gives us a list of things in verses 6 through 8. He lists out a whole bunch of things. I want to kind of help us think through what our gifting might be. And some of you might be sitting here thinking, serving at church, that sounds nice, but I don't really know how I fit. And I don't even know really what my gift is. Like, what am I actually good at? And maybe these 4 things, these 4 variables can maybe help guide you if you're thinking about, how should I serve? Maybe you're kind of itching to do it. Maybe God is tugging at your heart to serve somewhere, but you don't know exactly where or how. And so these are 4 things to maybe think through for us, 4 spheres to think through. The first is this, number 1, to discover the gifts that God has given to us. The first thing is maybe we should look at affinity. Not infinity, okay, affinity. That means, what do you like? What are your passions? From a more cynical perspective, I like thinking like this. What bothers you about the church? What irritates you? What annoys you? Because whatever you have a strong feeling about, you actually care about. Because our deepest passions actually stem from our greatest pains, right? And so what do you like? What are you drawn to? And I think maybe God has wired us in a certain way so that we can maybe serve in these places. The first is affinity. Second, affirmation. What have people said about you in your relationships, when you try something, when you plan something, when you're part of something? What do they say? What are their comments? Do they say, wow, you're great with people. You're very responsible. You're really good at communicating. You're really good at connecting. What do they say? And maybe that can give us a clue to how we should serve also. So the second is affirmation. Number 3, ability. Just because you are drawn to something and you like something doesn't mean you're good at it. What are you good at? There are certain things, and I'm sure some of us feel like this. We feel like we have we have God's grace to be in a position or a place where we feel like this is exactly my element. I feel so comfortable here. I feel like God is pleased with me when I'm doing what I'm doing. Like I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. You just feel like this is right. And maybe for some of us, it's this, because God has given us an ability to do it, and when we're actually performing, when we're actually serving in this way, it just feels right, because God has gifted it to us. And lastly, number 4, opportunity. So what are the needs of the church? Not just what am I good at, what do I want, what do I prefer, what do people say, but also, because we're in the context of a community, what are the opportunities here? What do people need? I love when people come up and they say things like, I want to serve somewhere. And I ask them, okay, that's great. Where do you want to serve? And then their next question is, well, where's the need? Where do people need help? And I think they get this, the idea of being committed to a community serving the body. So these are 4 things: affinity, affirmation, ability, opportunity. And so now, having this grid and kind of framework, let's go into some of the things that Paul is listing for us. And he gives us 7 things. This is not comprehensive. I know some of us did like spiritual gifts tests. It's like a Myers-Briggs Enneagram where you fill out all these things and at the end you get your top whatever gifts. But Paul here is listing 7 for us. There's more found in 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, 1 Peter, but we're just going to go through the 7 in the text for this morning. And we begin the list of 7 with the first one, which is prophecy. Some people have the gift of prophecy in proportion to faith. What does this mean? Don't get worried. Okay, I'm not going to go charismatic here. Okay, prophecy. Prophecy here is not so much maybe predicting the future, but sharing the revelation that God has spontaneously given to you. It could be through preaching, but other people have maybe said things, and maybe you've said things like, I get the sense that God is telling me this, or maybe you've actually had a dream, or maybe even a voice, or a strong impression that you feel like you need to share. That is prophecy. God is giving you revelation that you feel like you need to communicate. Number 2, the second gift, service, in our serving. And perhaps Paul here is thinking about deacons because it's the same word here. And it's holding an office or position to help organize, mobilize, and coordinate with other people. And see, we have a volunteers appreciation coming up at our church at the beginning of next month for all the people who are serving at our church. And I'm so thankful because we have over, I think, 300 people who are involved. Week in, week out, day out, building relationships, doing all of this. And I think for a lot of us, we have this gift of serving. We want to contribute. We want to help. Third gift, number 3, teaching. If prophecy is sharing spontaneous revelation, teaching is sharing written revelation from Scripture. And so there are some people who have the gift and ability to clearly, in an interesting, passionate, helpful way, communicate truth to people. And this is what hopefully everyone who occupies the pulpit, this is what hopefully we have, the gift of teaching. That's the third one. Number 4, exhortation or encouragement, urging people to live out God's will. There are just some people who are so passionate and encouraging, they always just want to kind of push you and nudge you in the right direction. And I think a lot of us who are especially idle or weary or tired, we really need a friend like this who has the gift of encouragement to continue to strengthen and bless us, especially in our communities. Number 5, contribution in generosity, in giving joyfully. They're generous. These are the people who never miss a tithe. These are the people who know the difference between what a tithe is and offering. It's different, they would say. These are people who maybe last Sunday gave to the building fund. They're ready to write the check because they have a generous heart. And a lot of us, we've been blessed by people who are just generous. They just want to give. Number 6, leadership with zeal. And this is where I think Paul is maybe having in mind pastoral staff, elders, overseers. And what I find so fascinating is every church website that has ever been created from the beginning of time, the number one thing they go on once you go on a new church website is almost always you want to click and find who the leaders are. You want to see who the staff is, what their values are, what they look like, what they believe in, because they are the people who make the decisions. Leadership's so important. And I'm so grateful that we get to serve with the staff we have here at Living Hope. And number 7, mercy with cheerfulness. And this is a broad term. Some people really have a heart for the sick, elderly, widows, poor, disabled, hurting, etc. Not everyone has every gift, but all of us, we do have a gift. That's why we're called to use it. We all need each other. This is why we're placed in a community. Grace humbles us so that we serve one another in community. And if you're a Christian here this morning and you're not serving anywhere, I would really encourage you to prayerfully consider and think about and ask the people around you, do you think I should serve? How should I serve? Where do I fit? What do you see in me? Begin some of these conversations. And there's others of us, kind of like the 400 people. That's a big chunk of our church, a little bit under maybe half. But if you're in this room and you are serving, you're serving already. You know, I was wrestling through some of this, especially this week. Just because you're serving, I don't want you to feel like, hey, I'm doing it. I did it. Did I even really need to come here this morning? I already believe in Jesus. I'm already a member of the church. I'm already serving. Do I really need to be here? I want to ask a few questions to kind of help sort through our heart as we serve, because I think Paul really cares about this. If you're serving at our church, first off, I really want to just say, I'm so thankful and grateful. So much of our ministry, we cannot do without your help. You getting involved in sacrificing time and energy and blood and sweat and tears for this. And so thank you so much. But I think there needs to be a depth of how we serve. We need to serve also in the right way. That's why Paul says prophecy in this way, generosity in this way, leading in this way. We need to serve with the right heart. And so these are a few diagnostic questions for us who are serving, especially for the leaders. The first question is this: are you using your gifts? Are you using your gifts? It is very possible to be serving in a church in a minimal way that is comfortable to us so that we don't need to use the gifts that God has given us. Very possible. I think a lot of us, so competent, so gifted, so successful in our workplace. And so when we come to church, those gifts and talents, we've spent it so much, we're tired. And so we don't want to pour out here. Paul is saying, use your gifts to build the body. Whatever God has given you, whatever those exceptional things are, use it outside, of course. Be a light in the world, but also to build up the body here. And so it's very possible for you to be serving, but not to be using and maximizing the gifts and talents that God has given you, because one day we're going to be all accountable to this. We're going to have to answer God in some way. He's going to ask us, how did you build the church with the gift I gave you? And we're going to have to say something about that. So the first one, are we using our gifts? Although we're serving, are we using our gifts? Number two, are you using your gifting or lack of gifting as an excuse for total obedience? Are you using your gifting or lack of gifting as an excuse for total obedience? Let me put it like this. I'm standing here doing my best to teach, okay? If I don't have the gift, you guys could tell me later in private, okay? Maybe tomorrow, okay? But I can be very tempted to think like this. I'm teaching. So do I really need to be generous with my money? I'm already teaching, come on. Do I need to be doing that also? And we use our gift as an excuse for another area of life where we feel like we can be disobedient in. And that's not okay. And for others of us, it's not the gifting we have that kind of shields us. It's the gifting we don't have. And so maybe we think of things like this. I don't have mercy. I don't really know a lot of people who are in poverty or hurting or disabled. So do I really need to care for them? Do I really need to care for them? Because I'm doing this other stuff at church. And the answer is, God calls us to total obedience in everything, gifting or not. We're called to sing, pray, give, meet. We're called to do all of these things, whether we're gifted or not. It's obedience to God. We cannot use our gifting or lack of gifting as an excuse to being radically obedient to Him. Second thing, the third question, diagnostic question for us. If you are serving here, thank you again. Okay, I'm not trying to, be too negative here, but if you're serving, is your serving bringing you closer to Jesus? Is that actually happening? Some of us, we feel like this is our story. We come into church, we get humbled. We're like, wow, I'm a sinner. We start confessing our sins. We come into faith. God has given us a measure of faith, so we believe. We're a Christian now. And then we get plugged into church. We become a member. We become committed. We have perfect attendance. Every Sunday, every Friday, every midweek cell group, we come out. And we feel like, okay, now I'm committed to the church. I've been humbled. I have community. I've been committed. And now we're serving. And we're part of this also. And you're like, hey, now like my picture's on the website or my name is on this list and I'm on stage and I'm doing things. And maybe what has happened is our serving, we feel like we're progressing in our faith, but what actually happened is now that we have quote unquote matured, we're actually now so distant from Jesus. And we've confused activity in church for intimacy with him. And for some of us, what we do publicly looks great because we're growing and talking and having conversation. It looks great from the outside. But when it comes to our personal devotional life, praying, reading, worship, it's gone. Thank you for serving, but are we serving with the right heart? Our service should be bringing us closer to Jesus, not further away. Not further away. And if you're in this room and you're not a Christian, or maybe you are, I don't want you to be confused. Humility in itself is not going to change you. Community in itself is not going to change you. Serving at church, it's not going to change you. These three things are pathways to bring us to Jesus. Jesus changes us. Jesus transforms us. Jesus looked at us in our sin, in our pride, in our isolation, in our idleness, in our comfort, and he humbled himself. And he says, without me, you can't change. You can't be saved. So I'm coming down. I'm coming down. And as he enters this world, he brings disciples together in community. And he never looks at them and goes to them and says, what are you going to do for me? But instead, his attitude with his disciples, with the people around him, each and every time is, how can I serve? I'm going to wash your feet. I'm going to forgive you. I'm going to teach you. I'm going to die on the cross to serve you, to give you what you could not do for yourself. I'm going to die and resurrect to give you new life so that you can be changed. If you want transformation, if you want to be changed, you need Jesus. Your relationship with him will change you. Grace alone will change you. We cannot change ourselves, but only by spending time, by going to him, cultivating that relationship, community, all of these things. It should point us to Jesus, and he transforms us. Let's pray.